Would you like to know ways to learn more, keep what you've learned in your memory longer, and study more effectively? The presentation you're about to see will teach you how to do just that. By incorporating the methods and techniques discussed in this video into your study habits, you will enhance long-term retention of information that you need to know. My name is James Olson. I'm a neuroscientist and educator at Wright State University. In this presentation, I first will describe the basics of what we know about how our memory works. You will discover why, to be an effective learner, you need to store new information and then have the capacity to retrieve it when needed. I then will discuss several methods for improving your ability to store information in your memory and retrieve it later on. Each of these techniques can be applied in your everyday study habits. Here are the learning objectives for this presentation. After you complete this video, you will be able to describe characteristics of at least 3 types of memory which the brain uses when storing information. Summarize the 2 processes which must be exercised for effective learning. Describe 6 methods that can improve study habits, and then apply the methods of effective learning into your own study habits. Education scientists have studied how our brain works when we are storing memories and information and then retrieving them at a later time. Instructors now use this knowledge to design efficient and effective educational programs. We also can use this information to refine and improve the practices we use when studying. It turns out that many of the habits most students use for studying do not improve their long-term retention of new information. This video will describe some of the less efficient but widely used strategies for study, explore how our brain processes information for long-term storage and retrieval, and illustrate several techniques that will increase the efficiency of your study time. We'll start by describing some of the study habits students use which are less than optimal. Typical high school and college students spend a significant amount of their time using study habits which are inefficient. Because the practices are simultaneously time-consuming and less than optimal, students get a false impression of the depth of their knowledge and understanding. In a survey of college students, the most common means of studying are rereading textbooks, highlighting books or other class materials, and reviewing class notes. This studying method is an example of mass practice, the continual repetition of the same material. Mass practice may seem effective to the student, since after intensive work at long-term memory storage, the material is somewhat easier to retrieve for a short while, maybe a few days. However, what is learned by this method is forgotten again in just a few weeks. Repetitive reading of the same material does little to build robust long-term memory storage. Instead, this can lead to an illusion of fluency. That is, the student develops an ability to recite the text without obtaining a deeper understanding of the underlying concepts of each subject and their relations to other information. Relations and associations between pieces of information are important when it's time to retrieve the information, such as during an examination. Highlighting important sentences in a textbook is little more than rereading with a pen. Little long-term information storage is achieved with this practice. Trying to learn information in bouts of intensive study is another form of mass practice. This method does little to help the student create a strong and consolidated memory of the information. Soon after the cramming session is over, the forgetting begins. However, since the information learned with cramming remains available for retrieval for a few days, students get a false sense of knowledge, that illusion of fluency mentioned earlier. To understand which study habits form better long-term memories, we should first learn about the processes our brain uses to store information. there are two parts to effective learning: storing new information and retrieving it at a later time. The inefficient study habits mentioned previously, rereading, highlighting, and cramming, are aimed at increasing the storage of information in our brain. However, to learn something well, we need to have both the capacity to place the information into our memory and the capacity to retrieve it later on. We now will look at these two processes and their role in learning. Scientists have discovered some of the mechanisms which allow us to store new information into our long-term, lasting memory. It turns out that there are several stages of creating a lasting memory trace. We can break this process up into 5 different steps. Retrieving the stored information is the 6th step needed to achieve effective learning. The first step is to receive information through our senses. Our brains are constantly receiving a vast amount of information. All of this information comes to us through our senses: touch, vision, hearing, sense, smell, and body position and visceral. We cannot, nor do we need to pay attention to all of these signals simultaneously. So our brain becomes selective. Of all the signals that are flooding from our senses, our brain selects only certain information to pay attention to. For example, as you watch and listen to this video, the touch sensors throughout your body are sending information to your brain about the temperature of your skin and the pressure felt from your clothes. For the most part, you are ignoring this tactile information and concentrating instead on the presentation. But if suddenly a hot coal were placed on your foot, your attention would quickly change to the pain you feel, and more than likely, you'd disregard the presentation. The selected sensory information is encoded as nerve activity and stored in a high-capacity memory termed sensory memory. When you're reading a book, this memory allows you to recall the subject of the sentence when you come to the verb. When listening to music, it allows you to follow the melody. While sensory information is high capacity, the memory traces that are created are short-lived, only a few seconds. The next process that we use to create a lasting memory trace is our working memory. Working memory holds the information in our consciousness for immediate use. Working memory has a much lower capacity than sensory information, and you can probably hold only about 5 to 7 items at any given time. However, working memory has a much longer persistence than sensory information, on the order of a few minutes. In working memory, the new information you have just incorporated is associated with things you already know. It is these associations that will enable efficient recall of the information at a later time. When the new information has been associated and connected to prior knowledge, its memory trace is stored in long-term memory. Long-term memory is high capacity, and as suggested by its name, has long persistence. So as you are watching the slides in this presentation and listening to this narration, new information has been stored in your long-term memory. This is the first part of the learning process. However, all the information that we've stored in our long-term memory will be of little value if we cannot recall it at a later time. As it turns out, scientists have found that the storage and retrieval processes in the brain are distinct and use different neural mechanisms. This has led to the development of novel approaches to education design and personal study habits. Common study habits stress memory storage and neglect the retrieval process. You recall that rereading and cramming are forms of mass practice, attempts at repetitive learning. The forgetting that occurs immediately after mass practice sessions occurs because the other mechanism for learning has been neglected, retrieval. For effective learning, both storage and retrieval must be developed. Adding methods to your study habits which exercise memory recall can significantly increase retention of new information in long-term memory. Each time information is retrieved from long-term memory into working memory, new associations can be made with other information. This will further consolidate the memory trace and enhance our ability to retrieve it later on. Education scientists have studied methods which can improve retrieval, several of which can be incorporated into personal study habits. In the remainder of this presentation, 6 of these methods will be briefly described. Practice retrieval. When information is retrieved from long-term memory into working memory, its memory trace is solidified. New associations are made with other knowledge, which strengthens the memory and facilitates later retrieval. The harder the retrieval during quizzing, the more firm the memory trace is established. There are a few ways to make retrieval harder. First, space the retrieval practice over time. It may be more difficult to recall all the information after a few days without studying it. Therefore, come back to the same or related quizzes every few days. Second, interleave different subjects during your study periods. After you've studied one subject, put it away and start studying another subject. Then, when you return to studying the first subject again, it will be more difficult. You may feel like you've learned less by this process, but in fact, your long-term memories have become stronger. Elaborate means to practice being the instructor. Explain information that you've learned to someone else. The other person could be a peer in your class or someone who has no understanding of the subject. Either way, you will be retrieving the stored information traces into your working memory and then establishing new connections to other knowledge. Generation. Previously, some educators felt that trying to solve a problem and failing at it would inhibit learning the correct method to solve the problem later on. We now know that this is not the case. Attempting to generate solutions to problems even before having learned all the information needed for the solution is an effective method of study. Try to imagine possible solutions to problems not yet encountered, even if you don't have all the facts yet to solve them. This process seems to prime the long-term memory to become more receptive to knowing the right solution when it's presented. When reflecting on material presented in class, try imagining problems that may be presented on examinations and working out how to approach their solutions. This method will strengthen conceptual understanding of the information. Reflection. Evaluate your own understanding. Be introspective about the depth and quality of your knowledge. This understanding of your knowledge can be derived in part from the practice retrieval exercises described previously. Calibration. Feedback is an important aspect of learning. The most incompetent individuals overestimate their abilities and understanding of material. However, after given a chance to be tested and corrected, their assessment of their own abilities is more accurate. Mnemonics. There are several methods used by memory experts and everyday people to remember facts. These include constructing a memory palace, a known geographic location such as a house in which you imagine objects are placed that you can associate with facts needed to be remembered. Another method is to associate a word or phrase with the facts. For example, the symptoms for stroke are remembered with the word FAST, which stands for facial drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulties, and time. Incorporating these 6 methods for improving your study habits will require some planning and preparation. For retrieval practice, you can use practice tests, which some publishers place at the end of textbook chapters, or create flashcards to help you remember important facts and associations between your new material. Elaboration works well in study groups with your peers. Take turns teaching something to each other. Work ahead in your textbook to challenge your knowledge. You can also generate problems that you may be tested on in your course. Work out their solutions as well as you can. Generation also is a way of reflection. It can be used to evaluate your level of knowledge and understanding. Do not be fooled by having fluency in your subject without a conceptual understanding. Mere fluency of a subject will not have sufficient associations to produce a robust long-term memory trace. Seek out feedback from your peers in study groups or from your instructors. Use the practice and classroom quizzes to your advantage to determine what understanding or knowledge is still lacking. Develop your own mnemonic devices to keep track of information and enhance your ability to recall it when needed. Incorporating these several techniques for efficient and effective study will maximize your potential for success. In summary, we've covered the objectives laid out at the beginning of this presentation. We've discussed why commonly used study habits are inefficient and ineffectual for generating consolidated long-term memory traces. We describe processes which take place in our brains to establish a long-term memory trace. And finally, we've presented several strategies for effective study habits which stress the mechanisms of memory recall in addition to memory storage. These are the references I used to develop this presentation. I invite you to look into these materials to delve deeper into the process of learning.